Hello and welcome to another Joe and Kat Chats. Today we're talking about voting in the US and Canada. Oh my goodness, how are you, Joe?
Catherine, I am staying hydrated, moisturized, and educated, and not necessarily in that
Amazing.
order, but
Great.
that's where I am with all of this right now. And I just
Mhm.
wanted to make sure that everybody understands what we got on with the T-shirt. We have Muhammad Ali, who is the greatest of all time, and we have Malcolm X, who is one of the greatest leaders of our generation or any generation. And in last week's conversation, towards the end of the chat, I said if you replace the I with we, illness becomes wellness.
Hmm.
That was from Malcolm X. I also want to go ahead and show you something from this book here. Okay. Muhammad Ali said a whole lot of stuff in his life: float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. Your hands can't hit what your eyes can't see. But he's also credited as having the world's shortest poem ever. Okay. And it says just like this. It says, me, we. Now, obviously, he didn't need to spell we like we were riding on a roller coaster, but it was literally the two-letter pronoun we, me, we. Part of the reason why I wanted to highlight that today is because voting is a perfect example of me, as in the individual,
Mhm.
hopefully getting to exercise my rights for the benefit of the collective, which is us or we. It is
Yes.
also about making sure that the individual, me, can better be a better human being to serve the humanity or the we. So in the when he said that poem at a speech during his 3.5 year layoff, that was the intent of the speech, of that poem. It was me, we. So when we talk about voting, when we talk about everything that is happening right now, it is about making sure that we are the best human beings that we can possibly be to ourselves and to other people. Thus,
Absolutely.
me, we.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for that. That's so in line with what we try to do, the two of us with these chats too. Like, really, we're trying to spread this knowledge that, we've been sort of both the knowledge that we have, gained from our education and what we are learning on a weekly basis about all these different topics. So
Absolutely.
yeah, so I really appreciate that. It's a really
Well,
great way to start off the chat today.
not a problem. Not a
I
problem.
also just had a quick note I just wanted to mention. We're actually recording this on Wednesday, October 14th. So when it's released, a lot of these things might have changed as far as, or a lot of the things might have changed as far as what we're talking about with the current election, which is going to be happening in 2 weeks as of the release date for this episode. So
Right.
we are going to encourage everyone to go out and vote because, oh my goodness, it's so important.
Right. Right. And Catherine, I want to make sure that the audience understands that this is not the intent of this particular episode is not to persuade anybody who watches or listens to this video to vote for a particular candidate. That's certainly not the intent. This is not a, we're going to try to make this particular episode as apolitical as possible. But we're also going to make it chock full of information because that is what we do each and every week, every Tuesday or Wednesday, whenever we decide to film on the Joe and Cat Chat series. So it's episode 20, talking about voting in Canada and the United States.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. So, should we get going with these definitions? What
Absolutely.
is a
Absolutely.
vote?
What is a vote? A vote is an individual decision to reflect personal values and political rights to represent the electorate or the body politic or the collective. Just like I talked about a couple of minutes ago in the introduction when I spoke about Muhammad Ali and when I said me, we. It is me. Those are the personal values and political rights to represent the collective. In the United States and in Canada, we have what's called a representative democracy, where we elect certain individuals that reflect the political, personal values and political rights of individuals in a collective body, otherwise known as the body politic. And those individuals are placed in positions of government to represent the personal values and political rights of the collective.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Now, something you're probably thinking about. You're probably like, well, Joe, you mentioned this word rights. And we're talking about the direction right. What are you talking about? A right is a moral or legal entitlement to something, whatever that is, or the moral or legal right to behave in a certain way. So there are a variety of different rights that people have. We have civil rights, we have human rights, we have personal rights, we have political rights. If you're driving, you have the right of way. If you have a TV show or any sort of copyrighted media, you have to reserve the rights to present that media. So these moral or legal entitlements are what are called rights. And the best way, and the reason we vote is an expression of those personal values and political rights. And when we express that endeavor, when we do what we need to do in terms of voting, it's what is called our civic duty. And you hear that term being thrown out. Hey, you're performing your civic duty if you vote. You get to wear one of those fun stickers and maybe take a couple of hours or maybe a few hours off of work in order to perform your civic duty. And your civic duty is a particular act that ensures that democratic values of whatever constitution for whatever country you live in, whether in this context, the United States and Canada, and make sure that those rights and those democratic values are upheld. Make sure that the people who wrote the 27 amendments of the Constitution, make sure that when you vote, you uphold the democratic principles that the Constitution was based on.
Amazing, yeah. And also, just as a side anecdote, we don't get stickers in Canada when we vote. So lucky you all. You get to Instagram your vote.
Yeah, we don't get
do a little sticker.
Yeah, we don't get stickers. They're not even scratch and sniff. They're just these generic paper stickers.
Just plain
old stickers that they give you. Because like, hey, you know what, you vote. You can put it on Instagram or put it on Facebook or whatever social media tool you want to use. But yeah, that's what we're talking about when we talk about voting. It's, hey, you know what? I believe in this particular candidate because this particular candidate has values and initiatives that I believe in that would benefit my life.
Mm-hmm.
And in a democratic government or a representative government, there's a group of people, hopefully, that will allow that particular political candidate to have that place in office. And I'm just thinking about this literally right now. There's years ago when I was in graduate school, it was for my concepts of nonprofits class. And I remember it was a PowerPoint presentation that I had to do about the history of nonprofits. And I started off the PowerPoint with a movie, about a 30-second clip from Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan. And in the movie Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan, there is a scene when Dr. Spock is trapped inside of this glass bubble, and Captain Kirk is on the outside of the bubble. And it's clear that Dr. Spock is going to die because the air is dwindling from inside of this bubble. And Dr. Spock looks at Captain Kirk and he says, logic dictates that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one.
Yes.
Okay?
Oh my goodness.
Logic dictates that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. Mm-hmm. So when you talk about public service and public servants that we want to have serve the body politics interests or the majority's interests, go ahead and YouTube that clip. It's about a 30-second clip. It's from The Wrath of Khan. When he says that a logic dictates that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. So that is what we were talking about when we talk about voting and the elections.
Yeah, for sure. No, I love that because that sort of embodies the my worldview and my ethos as well. So yeah, so I really appreciate that.
No problem.
I know that you mentioned that you wanted to talk about a few amendments in the U.S. Constitution that have to do with voting specifically.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious what those are.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, since we've been doing these chats and since I've been doing my live and direct chats, I've always referred to this wonderful document. Maybe not so wonderful depending on who you are, but this document that provides the foundation for the United States system of government. It's called the United States Constitution. And there are a bunch of amendments that talk about elections and government and presidential term limits and congressional member term limits and a presidential succession plan. But there are really three amendments that I want to focus on that really talk about the evolution of voting rights in the United States. The first amendment is the 15th Amendment. And I'm sure if you watched my speech that I gave at the People's Power Assembly a little more than 3 months ago, I talked about the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment said, hey, basically, guess what? Black folks, you're allowed to vote. And the specific clause that's in the 15th Amendment that was ratified in 1870 says race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So people like me back in 1870 could vote. Perfect. Now, later on the 19th Amendment, back I think in 1920, women actually were allowed to vote. Women were allowed to vote because the Constitution didn't have anything in the Bill of Rights saying, hey, these people can vote. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments, and that the Constitution was ratified on March 4th, 1789. So in 1789, it was understood that, hey, you know what? You can vote. But who was actually allowed to vote back in 1789? People who looked like who represented the body politic. Who were those people? White guys.
Old white men. Yeah.
Old white guys with money.
Yeah.
Because everybody who wrote this document was an old white guy that had money. And not just money, but assets and currency. Yeah. And when you talk about assets and currency, people who looked like me back in 1789 were not considered people. We were not considered human beings. We were considered assets and currency. The actual specific terminology that we'd like to use for this is chattel, which is movable property. So that is what we were considered as. We were considered as movable property. We were considered as chattel. We weren't citizens. We had to fight to prove that we were human beings. If you remember our first episode, we talked about the 4 fights: humanity, freedom, equality, and survival. We had to fight to prove that we were human beings back in 1789. Yeah. But in 1870, it's like, hey, you know what? We get the right to vote. Awesome. Then many years later, there was no specification as to what age limit you could vote. So it's conceivable that a 15-year-old in the year 1900 could say, hey, you know what? I want to vote for the president of the United States, because there was nothing in the Constitution stating that you couldn't do it. So the 26th Amendment said, and the actual specific clause, and I'm going to read this to make sure I'm specific, because I like being specific. I'm a specific brother. Says, who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any account of age. Mm-hmm. So guess what? If you have to be at least 18 years of age or older to vote in the presidential election. Now, there are some other specified rules here and there. For example, the 23rd Amendment gave residents of Washington, D.C. the right to vote in presidential elections. But that's a rather specific situation. But we're talking about generally speaking. Voting rights evolved over time. And the reason why voting rights evolved over time is because individuals had particular decisions that wanted to benefit them that ultimately would have benefited the collective.
Yes.
So when the 15th Amendment came about, it was like, hey, you know what? These Black folks are now emancipated as a result of the 13th Amendment. Let's go ahead and let them vote. Hey, you know what? These beautiful human beings that we call women, let's let them vote. Oh, you see them? They're 18 years old. They can go ahead and fight in the war. They should be allowed to vote on whether they want to have this war actually happen or not.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you brought this up previously, it made me think about sort of voter suppression. And that's sort of a big topic right now, given the election that's upcoming in the US. And really, I mean, you need 3 amendments to figure out like that anyone should be able to vote except for children. So like, it seems to me like what you just said is so accurate in that it really took a lot of process for people to be able to actually vote. And so, yeah, it just blows my mind that there's 3 separate amendments that had to sort of happen sequentially in order for the entire population to vote. And that's not even counting the, I guess, legacy of the 13th Amendment, where former incarcerated folks are not allowed to vote in many places.
Perfect. Yes, and in that 13th Amendment, and in fact, since I'm a prepared brother, I'm
You
going to go
are.
ahead and, I try and do my best, Catherine. I do my best. Now, it says here in Section 1 of the 13th Amendment, it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall be duly convicted, shall exist in the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So listen to that clause again, where it says, except for punishment of a crime. Okay? Now, what we want to talk about next is, because we talked about who's 18, who's eligible to vote. We said, hey, you know what? These people, Black folk can vote, women can vote, 18 years of older can vote. Well, who's actually eligible to vote and who's actually ineligible to vote? Since you mentioned the concept, the topic of voter suppression. Now, people who are eligible to vote got to be a U.S. citizen. So you can't vote in the U.S., Catherine.
No, as much as I'd like to.
I know, but I can. Even though I wasn't born in the U.S., I am a U.S. citizen, so I can vote in the U.S. election for president or anybody else who's up for election. You have to be 18 years of age or older. So I'm over the age of 18, so I can vote in the United States election. And you also have to meet your state's residency requirements and state's eligibility requirements and registration requirements. And there are 50 states in the United States. There's a particular website that I'd like everybody to look at if you're unsure as to what your state's registration requirements are. It is vote.gov, vote.gov. There's also another website that's incredibly useful. It's usa.gov/voting, VOTING. So if you have a question as to your registration requirements or your eligibility requirements, use those websites. We'll make sure we put links to both of those in the descriptions on all of our social media outlets, because we are informative people here at Joe Cat Chats franchise. We want to make sure that everybody has the information necessary to exercise their 15th, 19th, or 26th Amendment rights, depending on where country, if you live in the United States.
Yeah, we've also got voting websites in Canada. One's called vote.ca, and the other one is you can just go to electionscanada.ca to find out that information as well. But we currently do not have an election upcoming that we know of. There might be one in the near future, but we don't know yet.
We don't know yet. Now, we mentioned the 13th Amendment, and you mentioned this earlier. You said, hey, you know what? If you've committed a crime, you can't vote. Well, I just mentioned the requirements for who is eligible to vote. I also want to mention the criteria for who's ineligible to vote.
Sure.
Non-citizens. So again, Catherine, unfortunately, as much as I know you would love to participate in the United States election, you can't do it because you're not a citizen of the U.S. And this includes lawful permanent residents. There's a fancy terminology for lawful permanent residents. We call them green card holders because literally the card is green. I used to have a green card years ago before I got my citizenship when I was, I think, 13 or 14 years old. So green card holders can't vote because they're technically not citizens. Felons. Now, that varies from state to state. Again, use vote.gov to determine your eligibility requirements. But see where that 13th Amendment, that clause in the 13th Amendment comes in, because it says, except as punishment for a crime. So think about, if you've committed a crime, you are ineligible to vote, even though you might fit all of the other requirements to vote. For example, you are a United States citizen, whether naturalized, born in the United States, or acquired citizenship through the proper channels. So There's
Yeah, and
also, right, I'm sorry,
oh,
go
I
ahead.
was just going to interject, just so that folks are aware.
Mhm.
I mean, we're hoping that you've already watched a lot of the Joe and Kat chats already, but just to
Appreciate
clarify, we're talking about this amendment specifically, and linking it to voter suppression because BIPOC folks, which is Black, Indigenous, and people of color, are disproportionately incarcerated in both the US and Canada. And
right.
so that is why this is such a big deal, and that's why it's such a big conversation right now when it or surrounding voter suppression. So just wanted to interject and sort of insert that a little tidbit.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for doing that. And another one of the ineligibilities for people who vote are those who are mentally incapacitated.
Mhm.
Now, that seems somewhat subjective, but again, you'll need to look at your particular state's requirements to determine what their definition of mental incapacitation actually is. And there's another special rule. I mentioned the 23rd Amendment with regards to presidential elections and people living in Washington, D.C. This is also applies for presidential elections if you are a United States citizen living in a United States territory. And there are a handful of United States territories. So, Catherine, let's say I win the lottery for lots of money and I want to build a beach house in St. Thomas, Virgin Islands.
Oh, I'm coming to join you.
Well, fine. We'll bring me, you. I'll take my ex-wife to court so I can bring Parker down, and we'll have a grand old time. We'll hang out on the
Amazing.
beach. We'll do these shows every day, and we'll do what we do. We'll do what we do. We'll climb trees for coconuts. All of
Oh,
that.
beach
All of that.
life.
Beach
Oh.
life. We'll do it. We'll do it. But but you still couldn't vote in the election because you're still not an American citizen.
No.
But I'm an American citizen, but I would not be eligible to vote for the president of the United States. Why, Joe?
Yeah.
Why?
Why is that?
Why is that? Because United States territories are not states. And only those who are living in states are allowed to vote for the president of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So that is why the 23rd Amendment was written, because technically Washington, D.C., or the District of Columbia is not a state in the United States. That's why there are 50 states, and Washington, D.C. is not one of those 50 states. So let's say I were to say, hey, you know what? I'm winning the lottery. I'm packing up, moving to Guam. Okay. Or I'm going to join a relief effort in Puerto Rico as a result of the hurricane that struck several months back. I'm going to make
Mm-hmm.
sure that I do a little bit better than tossing rolls of paper towel and leaving cases of bottled water in the sun to overheat. I'm going to do a little bit better than that and actually build homes. Let's say I wanted to do that for the rest of my life. I can't vote for the president. I can vote for anything else. I just can't vote for president.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a lot to be said about the Puerto Rico circumstance, given the lack of response after that horrific hurricane a few years ago. I remember watching lots of news stories about people who lived there that really wanted to be able to vote and contribute, do their civic duty, and they couldn't. And then they're relying on this government to help them in times of crisis, in times of disaster and catastrophe. And the government was unable to do so for various reasons that I'm sure everyone can assume they know why. I guess. I don't know. I'm trying to not put my own opinion on things, but clearly,
It's okay.
we're of a certain leaning on the left right scale. I think the two of us, and the Joe and Cat chats are not like, we try to be transparent about that, at least.
Of course, of
So
course. I mean, there have been plenty of conversations. I think Malcolm X talked about in the autobiography of Malcolm X, when he talked about that Black people and certain people of color live in what's called internalized colonies within the
mm-hmm.
United States. Let's not, and we're talking about the president of the United States and disaster response. And this is something I know you have a certain expertise with, given your master's degree education. But take a look at what happened with Hurricane Katrina. I think it was 10 or 11 years ago. And the response to Hurricane Katrina, how you had a whole lot of Black people living in New Orleans that were standing on the tops of roofs waiting to get help. And there were a whole bunch of other hurricanes have happened in the past. And it's like, oh, yep, we're sending FEMA down right away. But, oh, a whole lot of black folk in New Orleans and Slidell, Louisiana, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana. No. Let's let those brothers and sisters drown. That's cool. They can swim. Or maybe they can't because of that stereotype about black people not being able to swim. Let's be really racist.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about that particular circumstance for an entire hour because that is the subject of many of the disaster literature I read throughout my education. It happened in 2005 during the Bush administration.
Yes, it was during the Bush administration.
The George W. Bush, I should say.
Right. President 43.
Yeah.
President 43, not 41. And speaking of that, I'm reminded of during one of the telethons when Saturday Night Live host Mike Myers, a fellow Canadian like yourself, and Kanye West were on TV together. And Kanye West looked into the camera and says, George Bush doesn't care about black people. And to this day, that might have been the most intelligent thing Kanye West has ever said. And much like a lot of other people who enjoy good quality hip hop, I miss the old Kanye. And I wish that Kanye would come back instead of this new Kanye that's coincidentally running for president and wants our vote.
Please don't vote for him.
Yeah. There are presidential ads with him on it.
I can't believe that. That's wild to me. I haven't really been exposed to it because, again, I have to seek out those things as a Canadian. I'm not looking for them. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about FEMA and the response that the government has a responsibility to do in disaster. Right. It's something that is in the political rhetoric a lot. But I say that with the caveat that it's not actually talked about a lot in sort of the public realm. Mm-hmm. Because sort of right-leaning people tend to want to defund things like FEMA, sure. And left-leaning people are more on the socialist side. They want to bolster funding for things like FEMA because it means that they're protecting people who are in crisis and who have had a disaster happen. Right. So we can definitely talk about that. I think one thing that we were going to talk about today is the Overton window, which is sort of I've got the definition here. It's a spectrum of ideas on public policy and social issues considered acceptable by the general public at a given time. And that's the Oxford Dictionary. So when we're talking about left versus right and this spectrum, the Overton window is sort of this, I guess, it's a window. So I imagine it as a box that sort of shifts along the spectrum.
Yes.
And then, go ahead.
No. You're exactly right, Catherine. It's a proverbial box that shifts along the spectrum. And just like anything else that we deal with in our lives, that spectrum or that shift takes place in time. Yeah. So if you think about this and apply it to voting, in 1776, a political candidate would have never come ahead and said, hey, you know what? Let's emancipate black folks. No, what? No way. We can't do that. No. You gotta have them working in the fields because that's too radical. That's way to the left. That's unthinkable. That's how we're getting rich. Years later, wait a minute, let's have people who look like you be allowed to vote. Whoa. We can't, no. We can't have that because voting's a rich white guy thing. Can't have that. No, there's no way. But okay, I'm drinking some ginger and apple cider vinegar here, but let's say that was moonshine. Let's say that was rum, or let's say that was whiskey. And let's say I wanted to transport that and make that for myself and make lots of money. Well, there was a time in the United States where I couldn't do that. And then some people came along and said, hey, you know what? I think it's really a bad idea to prohibit people from making adult beverages and not being able to sell them and transport them across state lines. wait a minute. No, you can't have that. No. So again, the Overton window moves over time. I know another topic that we are going to talk about, we might as well talk about this next after we talk about this Overton window, is the 2016 election and the Overton window, and how the Overton window was completely shattered and destroyed as a result of the 2016 election. Because if you look at many of the political rhetoric that was talked about in 2016, it would have been political suicide in 2012 for a political candidate to come out and say, hey, I want free college tuition for everybody, and I want free health care for everyone. Oh, no. That's too radical. That's way to the left. Hell no. That's outside of what we're talking about politically. We can't have that. That's too far to the left. The opposite is also true. In 2012, there was no political candidate alive in the United States that would have said the following: I'm going to build a wall and have Mexico pay for it. There's no political candidate alive that would have come out and said, I'm calling for the complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
Yeah.
What? No, that's unthinkable. That's too far to the right. In 2016, both of those statements were part of the political discourse. You had Bernie Sanders that came out and said, yep, Medicare for all, free college tuition for everybody. We're going to end the wars. And you had Donald Trump that came out and said, yep, see these Muslims? No, they're not coming into the country. And see all these refugees? We're going to shut that program for 90 days. By the way, watch episode 18 of the Joe and Cat Chats if you want to learn more about refugees. Mm-hmm. We're shutting down the whole refugee access program for 90 days, and to use his words, until we figure this thing out. Those were his exact words. That's too far to the right. No, we can't have that. So when you talk about the Overton window, there is a spectrum. Now that window, as you so eloquently and accurately described, Ms. Wells, is where acceptable policy is. And the middle of that window is policy. The further away you go from that window, there are different degrees of the political concepts that are talked about within the political spectrum. So on the far ends or the poles of the spectrum is unthinkable. As you move closer, you have radical. Then as you move closer, you have sensible. Then you have moved closer to the window, you have popular. Then inside of the window is policy. So in the middle of the Overton window is the center of the window. This is probably where the term centrist comes from, because they are generally accepted political talking points and ideologies for acceptable public political discourse.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense, that it sort of shattered the idea of an Overton window in 2016, because it was like it didn't know where on the spectrum to go. It just kind of shot to two ends of it and just
Correct.
Was so extreme. Yeah, that's super interesting. Do you see the same thing happening now? Do you think that it's still just on those very extremes?
I think, not to get overly political, Catherine, but I think given what we have in the United States in terms of the two main presidential candidates that we have now, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, I think the Overton window is quite honestly not much of a window anymore. It's probably more of a screen door rather than a window. Because what you have right now is you don't have a window that opens up all the way. What you have right now in terms of the political ideologies of Joe Biden, much of what Joe Biden talks about are quite honestly to the right of center of the Overton window. So many of his policies would be considered conservative or mildly Republican. Mm-hmm. If you remember Barack Obama back, I think in 2012, when he talked about many of his policies, he gave an interview, I think, to 60 Minutes, and he said, if I were a politician working in Washington, D.C. in the 80s, many of my policies would be considered moderately Republican. And that is a Democrat that said on national television that many of my policies would be considered moderately Republican. And bear in mind, Joe Biden was his vice president. Right. The apple's not going to stray far away from the tree when we talk about political ideology with Joe Biden. So much of what Joe Biden talks about politically in terms of not giving everybody health care and not ending the wars and continuing to drill for oil and not ending fracking, much of that, those are really Republican ideologies. And Joe Biden is like, yep, I agree with a lot of that stuff. So in terms of the Overton window has shifted so far to the right that people who have liberal ideas or what's considered democratic ideas really don't have much of an opportunity to express themselves in this current election, because the candidate who is the quote unquote Democrat really, quite honestly, has Republican ideologies.
Yeah.
And then the candidate who is Republican is so far to the right that most establishment Republicans are like, we don't really like him, but we'll support him anyway.
Yeah. A lot of them just support him anyway, which is problematic.
Which is a huge problem.
Yeah.
And not since we've kind of opened Pandora's box on all this, ideally what I would like to see happen to fundamentally change the way we go about our day-to-day lives politically, but socially and economically, I would like to see the Overton window move so far to the left that somebody like Hillary Clinton, who quite honestly had Republican ideologies, I would like the Overton window to move so far to the left that somebody like Hillary Clinton is thought of the way we think of Donald Trump now, as the furthest right-wing fringes of the Republican Party, or what is called the GOP, the Grand Old Party. That's what that abbreviation means, the GOP. I would like to see the Overton window move so far to the left that somebody who is considered a radical socialist, like a Bernie Sanders, is considered a centrist.
Yeah.
That's how far I would like to see this window move to the left. But unfortunately, the window has, at least, quite honestly, with the start of the Clinton era, moved to the right, and with each presidential term has moved further to the right, which is now why we have a right-wing demagogue in Donald Trump as the president of the United States. Because all we've done is move further to the right instead of moving at least back to the center, then moving to the left.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that that's a really important point, because when we talked about the 2016 election sort of shattering this Overton window, I think it's important to understand that it wasn't just 2016. That's not what created this issue. It's the 50 years almost of, neoliberal policies just sort of being pushed into the norm and the sensibility and the culture and the social understanding of what the US and Canada are. And it's similar here, but we're a little bit more further to the left, I think, especially since we elected Justin Trudeau a few years ago, and he's now been reelected as of 2019 in a minority government. So I think it's really important that we understand that neoliberalism has sort of snuck up on us in some senses, or at least for me, because I didn't see the start of it. I had to learn while we were going through it what it is, and it really does create this circumstance where we've normalized really right-wing policies, and that just feels normal to us. So when a Bernie Sanders comes along, we're like, oh, it's too much, but really that is a centrist view.
It quite honestly is. I mean, if you think about the person who I voted for the 2016 presidential election was Dr. Jill Stein. Much of what Jill Stein talked about was a personal reflection of my political values and my personal values and my political rights. That is why I voted for her. We talked about voting 32 or 33 minutes ago, and the very definition of voting. And part of the reason, the way we get systemic change, and that's a phrase that you and I have used ad nauseum in all of our conversations. Part of the way we get systemic change is protest, because a protest is a marketing plan for a grievance. And by the way, if you want to learn more about protests, watch our episode on protest. I think it was episode 2 or 3.
I think, yeah.
It was an early episode. It was an early episode. Watch that episode. Part of the way we get systemic change is through protesting, by saying, hey, look, we want change. We want justice. We want a demilitarized Green New Deal. We want Medicare for all. We want a universal basic income. But part of the other way we get that sort of systemic change is through legislation. And how do we get legislators that represent the electorate or the body politic in a representative government? We get that through voting.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
Active voting.
Yeah, and I think that that's also really noteworthy because, you know, we protest because that's the way to get attention, and then we need to continue that sentiment through the process of you know, getting policies changed in the government. So yeah, that's a really great connection. I appreciate you saying that.
No problem. It's two keys that are going to unlock that door. You need two keys to unlock that door. You're going to need people who are in the streets putting their feet to the ground and saying, hey, look, we need this door unlocked. But then you also need people in that can maneuver the levers of power politically, that are willing to have their feet being held to the fire to do what the people in the streets who have their feet on the ground want done.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's two keys that have to work synchronously in order to unlock that door of freedom.
Yeah, and I think something else that's sort of contributing to that is sort of when we have these elected officials that are supposed to represent us, one of the main issues in both the US and Canada, but I think particularly in the US, is money in politics.
Absolutely.
That's a big issue. And that
huge
is,
issue.
That is what is driving decisions a lot more than actual people, which is why the actual people need to protest, and we need to, you know, drive that change ourselves, because the candidates tend to, not all of them, but a lot tend to take donations from problematic industries that are doing the opposite from what the people want.
Exactly. So the quote that I mentioned from that Star Trek movie is a perfect application of what you just so eloquently said, Ms. Wells. Again, logic dictates that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. So if you eliminate money in politics, you don't have to worry about legalized bribery influencing a political candidate, because they'll be servant-driven leaders and public servants rather than private servants.
Right. Yeah, I think we could talk about that for an entire episode too, but I know that there is... Pardon?
That could be a mini series.
Yeah, for real. It's complex and problematic in so many ways. But one thing I wanted to get to before we run out of time today is the ranked choice voting, which is also called, I think you said it was also called instant runoff. Instant
runoff. It's also known in some circles as the Condorcet system of voting. That was named, I think, after a French mathematician, if my memory serves me correctly. We could talk about that. I also want to get to the Knight Foundation study in terms of the number of voters. Also want to get to that. We have time. We have about 15 minutes left. But RCV, ranked choice voting, one of the books I had to read, I didn't have to read the whole thing, but I had to read parts of it, is a book called Robert's Rules of Order. And it's by a gentleman named Henry Martin Robert. And he wrote essentially an instruction manual for parliamentary procedure and governmental procedure. And one of the parts of this book talks about quorums and meetings and minutes and all that other stuff, but also talks about ranked choice voting. And with ranked choice voting, you rank your political candidates in order of preference, rather than, oh, this party belongs to this party, this belongs to this party, I'm going to vote for this party because I like this party more than that party.
Yeah.
And you don't get an opportunity.
In Canada, it's less about the party than the candidate. Right. But they're still affiliated with the parties. So you have to pick one, and that's your vote, and that's it.
That's it. Exactly. And with that sort of winner take all system that we have in the United States and Canada, it's antithetical to democracy, because it doesn't represent. In some cases, you may not necessarily be able to represent the majority, because you have a limited number of candidates. Now, with ranked choice voting, you rank your candidates in order of preference. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And ranked choice voting works best when you're electing a single candidate, like an attorney general, like an insurance commissioner for a particular state. We're doing that in a couple of weeks here in North Carolina. Or your city or state's local attorney. Back when I used to live in Baltimore, the Baltimore mayoral race is up for grabs in a little more than a couple of weeks. The city council president is up for grabs in a couple of weeks. There are certain senatorial seats that are up for grabs and House of Representatives seats that are up for grabs in many states. Now, just because we go in the United States, we go to elections on the first Tuesday of every 4 years to elect a president. Every couple of years in the United States, in between those 4-year intervals, there are other elections for many of the political positions that I outlined a few minutes ago. Certain judgeships on the circuit court and district court level are eligible, are up for grabs in terms of voting. Local and state attorneys, the state attorneyship in North Carolina, where I am right now, that's up for grabs. It's up for grabs. And if I ever decide to come back and make my triumphant return to Baltimore, which probably will never happen, but if I do decide to run for Baltimore mayor, I could potentially win on a landslide. But then in 4 years, my job's on the line again. And if a bunch of people say, hey, Joe, we like you, okay, I get to keep my office on Holiday Street in downtown Baltimore. But if not, I'm out and somebody else will take my spot. So that's what we do with voting. It's an expression of personal beliefs and rights that represents the body politic. Now with RCV, we rank people, we rank our votes. And the objective is to make sure that with the runoff, when we count the ballots, that we get a majority. And a majority in ranked choice voting is 50% plus 1. 50% plus 1. So let's say I have 4 candidates, candidate A, candidate B, candidate C, candidate D. And let's say I have a voting population of 1,000 people. Let's say in this mock election, the candidate A gets 600 votes, candidate B gets 250 votes, candidate C gets 100 votes, and candidate D gets 50 votes. Contest is over.
Yeah.
It's over because you need 501 votes to win in that mock election in that population of 1,000 people. Candidate A got 600 votes, election's done, candidate A wins. Now, let me give you all another example. Let's say an example 2 that candidate A had 450 votes. And again, the magic number is 501. Candidate B had 250 votes. Candidate C had 200 votes, and candidate D had 100 votes. Well, that's your first runoff. Nobody got a majority. So candidate D is out. See you later, bye. Now, what happens with candidate D's ballots is the ballots get recounted, not only for candidate D, but for candidate B, candidate C, and candidate A. But we look at candidate D's first to see what their second and third preferences are. And those votes for second and third preference are allocated to those particular candidates. Yeah. So let's just say for the example that we're setting up here, that under candidate D had 100 votes. Candidate D's second choice had 55 votes for candidate A. And candidate D's third choice had 45 votes for candidate B. So 55 votes would go to candidate A based upon candidate D's ballots, and 45 votes would go to candidate B based upon the third choice selection from candidate D that now becomes their second choice because the first choice votes are thrown out. Yeah. Given that recount, or what is called a second runoff, you add 450 to 55, that is 505 votes. Candidate A wins the election in that instance. Okay, yeah. So that is how ranked choice voting works. It promotes more of a majority support, and it's a better reflection of the electorate. You also force political candidates to actually have a platform rather than just ideology that's tied to a political party. I said this in a conversation a couple of days ago, policies over pejoratives. It prevents mudslinging. So you can no longer say that, hey, vote for me because I'm not a racist, well, hey, vote for me because I'm not a rapist. That's not a policy. You
No.
actually have to have policies that people want to vote for.
Mm-hmm.
When you have ranked choice voting, you're going to have more political candidates that feel they have an opportunity to win. So what it does, it eliminates what's called the spoiler effect. So you don't have to worry about voting for a particular party that could potentially take away votes from one monolithic party or the other, like what we seem to have happening more often than not in the United States, because people say that, hey, you're wasting your vote on a third party. Well, no, I'm not wasting my vote. I'm exercising in my instance, my 15th Amendment rights to vote. So it's not a waste of a vote. I can
Mm-hmm.
vote for whoever I want. And at this point, I want to make sure that everybody understands. In the United States, again, given what we talked about earlier, there's this conversation of the lesser of two evils. We're voting for the lesser of two evils. Well, ranked choice voting eliminates that, because there's no more voting for lesser of two evils, because even if you vote for an evil, evil is still evil. There's degrees of bad, but bad is still bad. So whether it's manslaughter or murder, you still killed a person. It's just a matter of how you did it. It's still evil. And ranked choice voting eliminates that. Chris Hedges had a quote a while back. He said, in the American political system, you don't vote for what you want, you vote against what you hate. And that is so true what Chris Hedges said. And Chris Hedges is an absolute genius, I might add. But it's true. In the United States, what we're voting for against what we hate. We don't actually get to vote for what we want. If we have ranked choice voting in the United States, we can vote for what we want.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say it's a little bit different in Canada.
Yes.
Because we have first past the post, which is like, it's not a choice between two parties, although two parties have sort of dominated the political realm here for a long time. But we have a certain number of seats. And once you get 170 seats, if that party gets that many seats, then you have a majority government and it's just decided. Right. Whereas in my lifetime, in my voting lifetime, we've had a lot of minority governments, which means a party doesn't reach that 170 seat majority. And so the parties have to sort of deal with it and govern together. And it ends up just, they bicker a lot.
and that happens a lot in Germany when you have multiple political parties. It happened most recently in the German election with Angela Merkel. Mm-hmm. It's what's called a coalition government. Mm. You have different political parties where there's no majority political party, and you have a bunch of minority parties that now have to work together in order to make sure that the political agenda of a particular jurisdiction gets advanced. So it's called a coalition government, and that's what you have right now in Canada. You have a coalition government.
Yeah, absolutely.
You have NDPs working with conservatives. Yeah. You have liberals working with, to a certain extent, Greens. You have conservatives and liberals potentially with, whoa, wow, that normally doesn't happen. But since there's no majority, everybody's got to work together.
Yeah, and so one thing I just wanted to mention in this conversation is ranked choice voting wasn't really part of the rhetoric here, because we had an election last year in October, almost to the day, October 22nd of 2019. Yes. And proportional representation was sort of the wording that they used in the campaign, and that was particularly Trudeau, but it wasn't last year's, it was the election before that. And he created a coalition to investigate the options we had to change the voting to basically a ranked choice voting, which would include proportional representation. And that commission just sort of gave their recommendations, and Trudeau did nothing about it. And it sort of became the devil you know is better than the devil you don't, thing, which is similar to what you were saying. Absolutely. So it's an interesting thing where, a campaign promise is just sort of quietly tucked away.
Yep. Yeah. And it goes to a bigger point, because so much of what we talk about, we've mentioned this in a previous episode, we talked about diversity and inclusion. Mm-hmm. And RCV promotes more diversity and inclusion, not only in the political candidates that want to have a role in public service, but it also allows for more people to vote. And this is the perfect segue in the next 3.5 or 4 minutes of another topic I wanted to discuss here on the Joe and Kat Chat series, is a study by the Knight Foundation. Now, the Knight Foundation is a think tank in Washington, D.C. area. And they did a study called the 100 Million Project. And the 100 Million Project essentially says, hey, you know what? There's 100 million people in the United States that don't participate in voting at all. 100 million people.
They're eligible. Are they registered voters as well?
I'll explain that because
Okay.
there's a bit of nuance to it, but the 100 Million Project just sounds sexy, so they went along with it. Now, the Knight Foundation study said that of the 330 million people or so in the United States, there's approximately 250 million that are a voting age population. So based on the 25th Amendment, you're 18 years or older, you can vote. Of that 250 million, 230 million are actually eligible to vote. And we talked about voter eligibility. Can't be a U.S. citizen, can't be a felon, can't be mentally incapacitated, etc. So 230 million are actually eligible to vote. In the presidential election, the 2016 presidential election, 138.8 million ballots were counted. So right around 140 million ballots were counted, and there are 230 estimated voters. So give or take the numbers, there's approximately 92 million eligible voters who did not participate in the 2016 presidential election. So if you look at, so that voter turnout ended up being about 60% of the electorate. In an industrialized nation, that is an incredibly low voter turnout.
Yeah, it's about the same in Canada. It goes between about 60 and 70%.
Yeah, and it's an incredibly low voter turnout.
Yeah.
So Hillary Clinton had 65.8 million votes. Donald Trump had about 63 million votes. In terms of the percentages of eligible voters, Donald Trump had 27.3% of the eligible votes. Hillary Clinton had 28.5. There were about 3% that were other that voted for other parties, constitutional parties, libertarian parties, the Green parties. There were a whopping 41.3% of eligible voters who did not vote in the 2016 presidential election.
Wow.
41.3%.
Yeah.
So, and then there are reasons why. Lack of faith in the election system, lack of information about the elected political candidates. There's disenfranchisement about politics, and people have doubt about the impact of their votes. You feel like, hey, if I don't vote, I'm only one vote, but one vote doesn't matter. There's an old saying that my uncle told me years ago. He said, if you think you're unimportant, try being a fly in a bedroom when you're trying to sleep.
Yeah. Wow. That's so true. Oh my goodness.
My Uncle Lance was a genius. God rest his soul. If you think you're unimportant, try being a fly in a bedroom when you're trying to sleep.
Yeah. What a great message, because really voting is so important. And I wish I could emphasize it more here in Canada too. We don't have an election upcoming yet, but I do truly encourage everyone to go out and vote, because that voter turnout, like barely not even 60%.
Right.
I mean, that's the difference between, a landslide and it could make such a difference on either side.
Right.
Given that there's two primary candidates in the USA.
Exactly.
But oh my goodness, can you tell us those websites again to go look at your eligibility?
Websites again are vote.gov. The second one is usa.gov/voting, VOTING. And I know we got about 60 seconds left as well.
So I just wanted to thank you. I know we didn't get to everything we wanted to, which is always what happens, because we could talk for hours on all these topics, but Thank you so much for bringing
welcome.
this.
You're very welcome.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
It's been really informative, and I really appreciate you. So
I appreciate you too.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you remember what we're doing next week?
Not sure.
I feel like, yeah, we're going to have to talk about it, I think. But for everyone that wants to go back and listen, we truly do these because we care. And so go back and listen to all of them if you're listening to this for the first time. There's 20 episodes already. So yeah, and they're all just fantastic. So
absolutely.
Awesome. Well, take care, Joe. Bye.
Right. Peace. Take care. Peace.